I'm Richard Wolinsky. Lisa C. is the author of several best-selling novels, including Snowflower and the Secret Fan, Peony and Love, I'm Richard Wolinsky. Lisa C. is the author of several best-selling novels, including Snowflower and the Secret Fan, Peony and Love, China Dolls, and more recently, The Island of Sea Women. Her latest novel is titled Lady Tan's Circle of Friends, and it looks at the life of a real-life female doctor of upper-class birth living in China in the 15th century. The interview was recorded for the Bookwaves Art Waves Hour program on KPFA FM and KPFA.org and the Radio Wolinsky podcast on KPFA.org. You can subscribe to either or both through iTunes or listen on the KPFA.org website or bookwaves.org. My guest is Lisa C., whose latest novel is Lady Tan's Circle of Women, earlier novels, Snowflower and the Secret Fan, China Dolls, The Island of Sea Women. This is the 12th book. The first was nonfiction. The rest have all been fiction. Lisa C., in the afterword to Lady Tan's Circle of Women, you talked about the origins of the book. And you were working on a book that didn't quite work, that you'd been kind of doing research on for quite a while, and suddenly this book popped out at you, and it had been there, 10 years. So you look at the book and it was out of alignment or something, and you pulled it down and said, wow.
Like that. I don't know if it was fate, fortune, destiny, serendipity. It did jump out. And it may have just been out of alignment. I don't really remember now, except that I did pull it down. And it was called Reproducing Women, Pregnancy and Childbirth in the Ming Dynasty. And as you said, I'd had the book on my shelf for 10 years. I'd never opened it, let alone read it. And I just sat down right then and started to read it. And when I got to page 19, there was a mention of a woman doctor, Tan Yanshan, who in the Ming Dynasty, so 500 years ago, was a doctor. So that right off the bat was pretty interesting to me. And China does have a history of female doctors going back about 2,000 years, but very few and far between. I mean, still pretty extraordinary to me. But what was amazing was that in 1511, she published a book of her medical cases and when she turned 50. And I don't know, I just thought that was the most amazing thing. And I set that book down. I went over to the computer and just started to look around a little bit for her. And I found out that that book, Miscellaneous Records of a Female Doctor, was not only in print, still in print in China and in Chinese, but also available in English. And so I ordered it. I had it the next day. And so, although, and you know this, I do think about books for a very long time before I decide this is the one, that instead of thinking about this for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, it was all of about 26 hours.
How long between the time when you realized, oh my God, this book that I've been working on and off for 8 years that I thought was my next book after The Island of Sea Women, how long between the time when you put that aside, which was before the pandemic?
March 2020 was the shutdown. I think none of us really knew how long it was going to last. Remember, they were saying 2 weeks back to normal. Well, it turned out not to be 2 weeks. And I think it became clear pretty quickly that it wasn't going to be that 2 weeks. And that project was going to require a trip deep into a very remote part of China, not possible to do in 2020 at all. But even now, I'd be very reluctant to go that anywhere in the world that remote. I just saw that that's not going to work. So it was really from, well, we could even call it April of 2020, that there's that sort of limbo time when we didn't really know what was going to happen. And then, we realized it's going to be like this for quite a while. So I would say then from April to October. And it was in October of that year that I kind of stumbled across this book that was just here on my own shelf.
Well, quickly, what time frame was that other novel, and is it permanently aside?
It's not permanently aside, but that one still would require a pretty serious trip to China. It's based on a real couple, and he's kind of regarded as the kind of like the godfather of Chinese architecture. But he and his wife in the early 1920s, I'm remembering correctly, went out across China in search of the oldest wooden buildings. And they found them. And these buildings are still in very remote places, some of them, but they date back to the 800s. So the fact that there are these buildings that date back that far, and these two people had a remarkable life. She was a poet. They were both educated here in the United States. They were young revolutionaries. Young revolutionaries later in time are seen as bourgeois or whatever.
Right.
So they were, he in particular was punished in his later life during the Cultural Revolution and died almost utter.
You had the idea, you had it all working, but you couldn't do the kind of research you needed to do. Which brings us back to Lady Tan. That first name has an X in it. What is it again?
Yan Xian. So if you think of the X like Yan Xian.
So you take down the book, and what struck me immediately when I began to read it was that I have a friend who went the ritual and became an acupuncturist here in San Francisco. And the amount of work he did, and I'm thinking, boy, at that point, once you get into the world of traditional Chinese medicine, you have to know a lot, which means at that point, even as you're first looking through it and thinking, hey, this would work, you knew what was in front of you.
I did. And the fact that I wouldn't have the same type of access to material that I ordinarily would have had. I was and I'll just say one thing about having something as complicated with as much history, with as much sort of cultural implications as traditional Chinese medicine has. As a writer, there's also a part where you have to simplify it enough so that the person who picks up the book in a bookstore and goes home to read it, they're not drowning in that information. That it has to feel natural, but that you don't have to have every single thing in there. And how that gets woven in, that's that's the art of writing this kind of novel where I don't like to speak ill of the dead, but when I was in high school, I loved to read those Michener novels. And remember, they were so big, Hawaii, and it's this gigantic thing. And you're reading along, and there's a plot, and there's a love story, and there's, and you're turning the pages because you want to know. And then every once in a while, you'd have to stop for 50 pages to read about volcanoes. So to me, and this is something my editors have been very good at really keeping me on this, is how you pull out that information and take it out of there so that I think of it a little bit like that game Jenga. So you have you've built this tower and now you start pulling pieces out. You want that tower to still be strong, but you don't have to have every single piece in there for it still to look like a tower. So, there's a kind of rule of thumb that my editor and I have, which is, yes, she'll allow me 3 pages of history or, some background thing that I'm fascinated with. But then any one word beyond that, she's like, come on, you've got to cut it. And sometimes she's just like, look, you have a paragraph here and it's just stopping the action. So how those things get woven in so that people, particularly with something like traditional Chinese medicine, that it has to still feel real. It has to be accurate, but you don't have to put every single thing in, because people aren't studying to become doctors. They're reading because they want to be entertained and they want to learn something maybe.
At the same time, you kind of know those blocks have to be in the tower in your mind, because then you have to know what you can pull. And
Right.
that
So my
becomes
first
difficult.
draft, yeah, my first draft is very long because I have to put in everything that I found. I want to use it. And then that's the whole editing for me is stuff out. Like, how much of this do I actually need to have for it to make sense and still feel full and rich? It's not the dietetic version, but that it doesn't have to have every single detail.
Well, we're going to go into a lot of those details in a minute, but
Can I
there,
kind of give it? Can I give an example because this just popped in my head?
sure, go
So
ahead.
Tanya and Shun, she has several remedies, and in her book, she describes: here's the patient, here's what's wrong, here's what I'm suggesting for her remedy, and here's how to make it. And so, let's say a remedy has 10 ingredients. I don't have to put all 10 in. I think it's more important to maybe use 3, but talk about why those 3 are important and what they do. So, see, it's not a whole recipe, but it's taking some of the things from the recipe and expanding on those so that then they make sense. Like, oh, if you take this root, here's what it does for you and why. And here's the history, maybe even the history of it or how it was discovered. And to me, that's much more interesting than having a list of 10 ingredients just on their own.
Before we go into the creation of the plot, and then we're going to get back to some specifics, because it feels as researched as it is, Lisa C. Acupuncture, herbs, pills. Lady Tan is using pills, she's using herbs and teas. I couldn't get a sense whether there's any acupuncture. There's one
She
point,
did not use acupuncture.
okay, there's one point where she's putting things on 8 different places on a body, and I'm thinking, what is that about?
Yeah, so that's called moxibustion. And the way to kind of visualize it is sometimes you see incense in the shape of a cone. So
Okay.
these are often in the shape of a cone, and they're put on the acupuncture spots and then lit like incense. And as they burn down, the ingredients of this cone are sort of seeping into these channels.
Was there acupuncture then?
There was acupuncture. She just was not. She didn't do it.
Which you found out because she doesn't mention it at all, I guess.
She doesn't mention it, and her grandmother, who was also a doctor, didn't use it. Her grandfather, who was what's known as a literati doctor, a doctor who learns how to be a doctor by reading books, he didn't use it. So she was really learning from them, and they, for whatever reason, preferred to stay with herbs and moxibustion.
In the book, we learn a lot about what it is like to be a very wealthy young woman, because she's mostly young in the book, in that time period. And also because you have her midwife best friend, we learn what it's like not to be a wealthy woman in that time period. You do make the mention that they both envied one another for what they could and couldn't do. You, Lisa C., which would you rather have been?
Well, personally, I would rather be able to be out in the outside world, even though that meant probably in some ways my life would have been harder. But living in utter seclusion is not, I think that's difficult. And I think that was very highlighted during the pandemic, that many of us discovered, gee, being alone 24 hours a day after day, is not so great. And also not even being able to go out and do the things that we like to do, if it's going to a concert or a play or a museum, but even something as basic as going to the grocery store. all of a sudden had a very different feel to it because, well, I suppose you could say you were risking your life every time you went to the grocery store, but also it's the contact that we have with the outside world, what we see, what we hear, how we interact with people, all of those sights and sounds that are the things that fill us. And I think also, fill us emotionally and psychologically, but also are the things that help to feed our creativity and our empathy. And so, that's just me of how I sort of feel about being in the world. For these elite women, and Tanya Shun, she came from generations of imperial scholars. Her father was very high up in one of the government boards, the Board of Punishments. Her father, her grandfather, her uncle, all really high up. And this was without question an elite family. She was highly educated. She went to live with her grandparents when she was 8 years old, and she used to recite poetry to her grandfather at night when he would drink wine and she would recite poetry. And I don't have this memorized, but she writes about it in her foreword to her book, that he said something like, "This girl is very smart. We shouldn't let her confine her to embroidery and reciting poetry. We should teach her," and he said, "my medicine." So his idea of his medicine is out of books, but it was really that she learned under her grandmother. And then, but being so, highly, highly educated, very privileged, has her own servant from birth. But I think price of that is that confinement and the restrictions that were placed on these elite women. So, of course, she goes into an arranged marriage when she's 15. I've written about arranged marriages in my other books, but I think about it a lot. And actually, all the research today show, because there's still plenty of arranged marriages in the world, that arranged marriages actually tend to last longer than love marriages. So there is an interesting thing to think about. But the other side of it is, I think about being a 15-year-old girl, and you're dressed up in your outfit and you're taken, in this palanquin, you can't see out, you're taken to your husband's home, you're taken back, can't see anything because you have this veil over you. And then basically you're taken to the back bedroom to have sex with your husband who you've never even seen before. And that must have been, you would understand, oh, this is the culture and this is what everybody does in our class and this is what's expected of me. But there must have been a part of that was really terrifying and very scary. So that's one thing. Another is that, people of that class live together in these large compound homes where you'd, surrounded by a wall, and inside there'd be different courtyards. Maybe one family would live on this one, but you're living with between 40 and 100 of your husband's relatives. And you're not seeing your relatives. You're not seeing your friends. You're now, for the rest of your life, kind of confined within these four walls with these people, and in particular in the women's quarters where women would spend their entire day. And even within that, there was this kind of class system where you had servants, you had the concubines, you had the wives. Sometimes there were secondary wives. There's the one woman who's in charge. And so and if you've ever watched like a Chinese soap opera that takes place in imperial times, there's always this fighting for incremental territory, an incremental power within that women's chamber. And to me, again, just thinking how that would be for me to live with all of my husband's female relatives and spend every single day with them from morning till night until I died. That, not that I don't love them, but it is like my version of hell, right? And that you wouldn't be able to go out um, in this novel, I mean, and in this time period, this was Confucian thought really went through society, culture, family, and really set what people could do, what those boundaries were. And he was a great thinker, don't get me wrong. He was a great philosopher, but he didn't care for women. I think that's really fair to say. So, one of his sayings is a good woman will never go more than 3 steps beyond her front gate. So, that meant that really, if you're following Confucian thought, that you're really keeping women completely confined for the part of their lifetime. I suppose the upside is they're not as exposed to epidemics, they're not as exposed to war, they're not as exposed to certain kinds of violence that you would see on the street. I mean, they're very, very protected. But when you're that, and I'm just trying to say there's a downside to that total protection and isolation.
And I keep thinking as you're talking that you have a choice as a writer to have something third person, which is kind of God looking down, close third person, which focuses on one character but could expand outward, or first person entirely. And it struck me as you were talking that there were two reasons to make it first person for you. One is that you're writing this in the pandemic, and it's very easy for you, given your isolation, to write about someone's isolation through their eyes. And the second is it makes it a little bit easier on your research on what's going on outside.
I don't know about the second part. The way I think about it is that if you can live in their shoes, if I'm in her shoes, there's that whole thing of the unreliable narrator. So I think she's actually pretty reliable. I've had other people in other novels who aren't very reliable, but she only knows what she knows. She only knows what she can see. She limits her in certain ways. But on the other hand, she does have a certain amount of knowledge that no one else has. But she is limited in her sense of the world beyond. And so that and I don't think this gives anything away to say that she does start to venture out, it's all completely new to her. And if she drives by goes by the butcher shop, she's seeing that for the first time. If she's on a river, being transported from one place to another place, she's seeing the big open sky for the first time. And I think there's a limitation there, but also it's a way to bring fresh eyes to something that could seem ordinary, right? Like, if I said to you, "Oh, hey, Richard, what's the sky out like today?" You'd be like, "Yeah, whatever. It's sunny, it's cloudy, it's foggy where you are. I don't know." But for her, who had only seen just a little sliver of sky for most of her life, to actually see that big sky for the first time, it has a very different impact. And to try to capture that, was for me.
Lady Tan's life, what we know of it is obviously we just have a couple of pieces of information after the age of 50, but even at that point, there are many, many. So, in a sense, even though you've got these various patients and you can add them in or specifics there, you're basically creating her life for her.
Right.
In the afterword, you talk about how there was no way of knowing if she actually did go to Beijing. And so
there's no record of her ever leaving the town of Wuxi after she moved there, that she ever left.
And you made the decision that you would take her to Beijing. What prompted that decision, or was it always there in your original conception?
It wasn't there in the original conception, but there were two things that did prompt it. The first was in addition to her own book and her own cases, I was really looking at the historic records, particularly about women's health and women's reproductive health in that time period. And it's amazing what has been saved and what's available. So, for example, that book that I first pulled down, Reproducing Women in the Ming Dynasty, this is, that's a huge academic book on that subject with many, many, many cases. And that was just one source for me. But every once in a while, I would read of a case and think, I've got to use that, and leads me to the second part of why I wanted her to go to the Forbidden City. And I've already touched on it a little bit, but it's that idea of, we'll say, like women on a continuum, where in the past you could say servants, concubines, wives, spinster aunts, all the way up to the empress. And we would have, working women, the woman who holds the tiller on the ship, the tile maker, a midwife. These are women who are out in the world, very different from the ones who are confined. But they're all on this same continuum. And we can relate that to today. You could say, oh, it's a maid who works in a hotel, or, a young, beautiful girl who's out dating somebody new every night, or, a mom with 3 kids in a van, and you go all the way up to what would be the equivalent of the Empress, we'll just say Beyonce. And that we have these parallels, even though they may look different on the outside. But so I was thinking about how women are on this sort of stratified layer of what their lives are like. Somebody who lives in the inside, somebody who's out in the outside. But what unites all of these women, whether it's today or in her time 500 years ago, or we could say when we're all living on Mars 500 years from now, or maybe sooner, is that we're united through time, through geography, through space, by this unique physiology and biology that we have. And so, when I'm writing a novel, it's not just the plot. I obviously have some themes that I'm exploring. And so those were 2 of them that felt to me very connected. And that with this amount of knowledge that's out there about what women's lives were like, and how women were taken care of in those days, that there were stories that I found that I felt, oh, this actually helps me think about this idea of women on a continuum. It helps me think about, it doesn't matter time, space, geography. That could have happened today. It could have happened 500 years ago.
A couple of ways to go here. One would be to throw out some of the specifics and have you talk about them. The other is to ask a little bit more generalized questions. I'm going to try to combine them if I can. When you're doing your research and looking for something that's going to grab your attention, because it grabs your attention, it obviously has to go in the book. What were a couple of the most amazing things that you wouldn't have even thought of unless you found it?
The worm.
Like the worm and the eunuchs with the arrow.
I could never have imagined that or made it up. Well, there are 3 for me that are the big standouts. So the one is the worm. The next one is when the message is written on the baby's foot. I'm not trying to give away too much. And then the thing that does happen in front of the Empress. All 3 of those incidents happen to real women. And so they could seem, far-fetched or made up, but those are the ones that are completely grounded in historical fact.
Yeah, I lost a little of that. I would hope that we have it, but people should know that we're on Zencastr and there are sometimes pauses and it's not clear if I'm seeing what you are seeing when you're watching this. So I missed the last part of that, but we're back.
Well, I'll just say that those 3 scenes happen to real women. And when I found them, I just felt like, oh my God, I've got to use it, and I think all three of them on the surface can seem unbelievable. But the fact that they happen to real people, real women, that's why I use them.
And then the next question is, okay, we know what's amazing. What about the weirdest thing you found other than the worm? Just something that she did, something that you found in your research where you're going,
Oh,
huh?
yeah, I think the idea of ghost pregnancies.
Yeah.
And what would happen is, let's say a woman's husband died and 5 years later she gave birth, or someone's husband has been traveling for 2 years and somewhere at 18 months she gives birth. So there was this idea of ghost pregnancies, that you could be pregnant for way longer than 9 months, and that this what struck me about it was that it was a way to actually save a woman's virtue, right? I mean, obviously a woman wasn't pregnant for 5 years after her husband died, but this was a way that within the society they could say, oh, she gave birth to her husband's son, it was a ghost pregnancy, but we don't have to ostracize her, punish her. And this was particularly important in these big elite family homes where you certainly didn't want to have scandal, but that it all a way to protect women in an interesting way, because on the surface it seems like that it's so far-fetched.
I also noticed, speaking of the eunuch and the arrow, which is a quick story that you said actually happened as well. There's a lot of eunuchs in the Forbidden City, but none elsewhere. Is that correct?
That's right. Well, there were some who were sent out on behalf of the emperor, and in under different emperors, there were periods where the eunuchs had extraordinary power and were really basically running the government. And so if they were running the government, that meant that they were going out across the country. They were the eyes and ears. But originally this started because the emperor could have as many as 10,000 women living with him. And, if any of those women got pregnant, they better belong to be potential emperors themselves, that they had to be in direct line. So that this was a way of sort of protecting they didn't call it a harem, but, for now we can call it his harem of women.
Also, the relationship of concubines. Did that surprise you, or had you know about that before? That concubines were kind of an official part of these wealthy families, and that if a concubine gave birth, that child, even though it was born out of wedlock, could wind up being the heir.
Right. And actually, in my family, I don't have to look far for this. So, in my own family, my great uncle, he had 9 sons, but he had a total of 3 or 4, I can't remember, wives. And it was actually the second one. She wasn't a wife; she was just a maid in the house. Was the first one to give birth. And so in my family, and this is pretty traditional in Chinese families, it was number one, number two, number three, number four. And they still, to this day, refer to themselves to each other that way, not by their names, but by their birth order. And so the person who was actually number one was the son of the maid. But then number two, he was the first son of the wife. And always in my family, there has been this way that they will say, well, he's number one, but he's really not number one. This one is number one. And all the way to today, they still talk about it that way. And
And the
what that meant, in terms of who was the eldest son.
And the other side of it is that if by some chance the father can't be a father, then the wife or concubine could actually have her own person, her own man, and that the son there would then be adopted as if he was the official son. Did you know that beforehand?
Yes. But this part really has to do with the afterworld and traditions surrounding the afterworld. I mean, I've about it a little differently in Lady Tan's Circle of Women, actually a little more directly than I have in some of the other novels where, it's always important to have a son. And I think in all of my books, actually, the importance of having a son. But the reason why that's so important is that so many of the holidays, particularly Chinese New Year, which, is across Asia, but might have different dates. Part of that is making offerings to your ancestors who are in the afterlife. The thing is, in the afterlife, it's like a parallel world to this one, where you have all the same needs, wants, and desires as you have here. So you need to have food, you need to have clothes, you need to have a place to live, you need to have the newest phone, you want to have a flat screen TV, all of the things that we want here, they need there. And so in China, but you can see it here too. In the lead up to Chinese New Year, you'll see people maybe making offerings of fresh fruit, but sometimes they make things out of paper mache, or you can buy stuff. I've seen in China, people on a motorcycle driving with a huge flat screen TV that's made out of tissue paper, basically. And then you set fire to them, and then they travel to the afterlife to your family to use. And out of their gratitude for your offerings, they're going to reward the family throughout the year with happiness, a good job, money, good health. And so it's this very connected relationship between the everyday life and the afterlife. And it's a very quid pro quo. But here's the catch. Only one person can make those offerings, and it's the eldest son.
So there has to be one.
Yeah, and that's why you have to have one. So China does have this very old, very deep tradition of I'm going to put it in air quotes, adopting someone else's son to be your elder son. So, for example, if I had 5 girls and my sister had 5 sons, I might adopt one of her sons. It's not a true adoption. I'm not raising that child. She would still raise that child, but I would pay for his education and whatever. And in return, after I die, he would take care of my grave. He'd make offerings for me.
Well, that brings up another question, which is when you're doing the research and putting in your book, Lady Tan's Circle of Women, when you're putting that in the book, each of these segments about treating various patients contains information which modern traditional Chinese medicine might use. And there are reasons to believe that that works and that
Mhm.
it's a different science of medicine. But there's also this other stuff about these superstitions, the religious superstitions, and trying to blend the two into something that makes sense. I kept shaking my head and going, yes, yes. Oh, for some reason that has to do with snakes, as opposed to reasons that have to do with balancing your chi.
Hmm.
And at your end, when you're writing this, how are you feeling and how are you dealing with putting in the legend and then the stuff that we know works?
Well, I mean, a lot of things come out of legends and stories that are passed down for why something works. I mean, traditional Chinese medicine's been around for 2,000 years, so it has a very deep history to it. And so many of the ingredients, we'll call them, of these different, whether it's from stone or dried animal of some sort or herbs, that somebody had to discover that originally. And often there is a story behind how that was discovered, and so that can seem kind of magical. But on the other hand, and you sort of bring it up with this religious idea, it's like in communion in the Catholic Church, are you actually taking the body and blood of Christ? Well, that it's a metaphor, right? It's not, you're not go up for your communion. You're not actually, you're having it's like the opposite. And so I don't think that this is unique to the Chinese. I think you'd find that in almost any culture.
Were they all so formal with each other? Or is that, or is something that we arrive at now in terms of how we, quote, translate what they're saying?
This is a very good question. Let me think about that for a second. I think that those big elite homes, there was a certain formality that comes from a couple of things. First, everybody has their position, right? And one thing, like in Chinese language, you have a different word for your maternal grandmother is a different word from your paternal grandmother. Your paternal aunts and uncles have different names than your maternal aunts and uncles. It's pretty much, actually, a lot of that is built into the language so that when you're addressing someone, if you say second aunt, you know exactly where they are and it is a sign of respect too, that you're addressing people in that way. But I would also say that in a practical way, it, again, in these big elite homes, that it was a way of kind of people, right? You always know what your position is because people are saying it all the time. You're being reminded of a position all the time. And I don't know if you noticed this, but the concubines in this novel, they are like Miss Chen, Miss whatever.
Notice, yeah.
The servants, they all have names like Sparrow and Inky, and that those are just names, but they're just because they're regular people that don't have any rank. And so I just partly it's part of the whole language was developed. You always know where you are in your family, but that also in those big elite homes, this is a way of keeping people in their place.
Second, I'm just looking at my notes here. Um, Smallpox vaccinations existed in China in the 1500s. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was called variolation. So it's an early form of inoculation. And, we've been talking about it. We were living through that first couple of years of the pandemic and having lots of discussions, of course, about vaccines. And was this a good thing? Was it a bad thing? What could it do to you? And what amazed me is that with variolation, I guess I should say a little bit what it was. They would take the scabs from someone who had probably died from smallpox and grind them up and then blow them through a tube, like a long straw, into someone's nose. Or they'd take the gooey, gunky stuff that came right off of those suppurating smallpox wounds and rub it on under your nose, or wrap it and put it in your nose and then nose for a couple of days. And so obviously there were some problems with this. Some people could get very sick, some people could die, some people would be very scarred. But if you lived through that process, you were basically inoculated against smallpox for the rest of your life. And so because there were risks, and a lot of it had to do with beauty for women, and especially at a time when women were being bought and sold, where if you're an elite family, yes, you're going to go hopefully into an arranged marriage, but if you are covered with smallpox scars, you're not going to go into a great one, even if you're wealthy. So these were to them. And so what I was going to say is that what really struck me was that the pros and cons and the exact same arguments that we had been hearing for the last 3 years in the exact same language was going on right then.
That's pretty amazing. You go into details about foot binding. It's appeared in other books, so I don't really need to go into that. But you do kind of focus a little bit about how these wealthy women with their foot binding, that their entire life is in pain. When you're writing that, looking out through their eyes, what's going through your mind?
Well, I think it's not just that they were in physical pain. And, just to put this in context, a woman's toes were broken, the bones in her midfoot were broken. The way to kind of visualize it is that it's almost like rolling up a sock, right? And so all that a woman was left to walk on basically was her big toe. So if we think about just for a moment what that would feel like, and those bones that are all wrapped up, like the sock part, they're not healing. They're still all broken in there. And maybe in some cases they would fuse together, but really they're just all held together with these long strips of binding cloth. And so you're walking on that every day. I don't see how you couldn't be in really major pain all the time. But there was a second part to your question that I just
Oh,
spaced out on.
I
You
didn't.
did too, so I know I'm
No,
really.
no, don't worry about it.
Oh, I know what it was. It was the lifetime care that was
Right,
involved in
right.
having bound feet, and that if what the consequences were if you didn't take care of them, um, and the reasons why a woman might decide she didn't want to anymore.
Uh, Behind all of this story and all of this detail, you do something else, which I don't want to go into too much detail about, but we'll put it in modern literary language. At various points, you put a gun in a handbag, and you do it several times, and eventually, obviously, the gun comes out. This is all metaphor for what actually happens in the book. At what point did you realize that you were going to create this behind the scenes plot?
It was pretty early. I didn't see this directly as a mystery. My first three novels were mysteries. I don't see this as a mystery. However, there is something that does happen. Like you said, it's in a behind the scenes plot. And much of that was inspired by another book that I found called The Washing Away of Wrongs, that was originally published, I think it's in 1247. And it's the earliest book in the world on forensics. I thought it was interesting, and again, this sort of is thematic, right? That Yenshen's, all the men in her family work for the Board of Punishments. And that this board, these men are tasked with investigating crime. They're the investigator, the arresting policeman, they hold the trial, they're the judge, and they make the sentence. And it really, and because the sentences, the punishments, I mean, it's called the Board of Punishments, right? That because the punishments were so severe for even pretty mild crimes, I thought about the the darkness of that juxtaposed to this medicine and healing people and bringing to the world, and that these were such opposites, but you had it within the same family. And I think that certainly for Yan Chun's grandmother, this was something that drove her very much in her practice of medicine, was that it was the yin, it was, the yin and the yang within this one family of this really dark way of um, punishing people and holding them responsible, but at the same time, on the other side, you have trying to heal people, bring people into the world. One thing I will say about the washing away of wrongs is I just recently did an event in Colorado, and there was a woman there who had studied forensics here in this country, and one of her textbooks was The Washing Away of Wrongs. And the reason is not, I mean, yes, there's a lot in there that is still used today for how you determine, did someone drown by accident? Did someone hold their head down? Did someone hang themselves on purpose? Was it an accident? Is it staged? All that stuff is all in there, and it could still be used today, right? If you're really looking for that, because I guess a dead body doesn't change that much over the centuries. The same thing to show up. And what she said, though, was that the reason that they used that text was that there's so much in there about how you see a body from death to this transition to, from life to death, and what happens to the body, and why it's important to care for the body. And they were using that in her class. So again, I go back to this idea of, bringing people into the world, but also seeing people out of the world.
What are the 6 grannies?
What are they all? Well, they're, gosh, can I remember them all? Midwives are in there, religious women, matchmakers, procurers. I don't know if I have all 6, but these 6 categories of women, all working women at some degree, were seen as really like the low, really low in society. And that if you were elite family, you didn't want any of these people coming into your home, even though they have a necessity. You may not approve of midwives, but you need to have them. You may not approve of matchmakers, but you often you have to have them. So again, to me, that again goes back to this sort of light and dark, yin and yang, where you're trying to find a balance. Society's saying, no, these people are the dregs of society, and yet you need them, even if you're, at an elite family.
Trying to see if there's any other questions I want to ask about this, and then I want to have a couple of other questions for you. I guess this is just my own curiosity. There's a boat that she travels to and from Beijing on. I could not get a sense. She had all of this stuff with her. How big were those boats?
I don't think she had that much stuff with her, because I think a
She,
lot of it
on
had
the
been
way
sent
back,
ahead. You're talking about when she leaves her childhood home and goes to her grandparents.
no, I'm talking about when she goes from her home to the Forbidden City. She has a lot on the way back,
Oh
boxes
yes,
and
yeah,
loads.
yeah. Well, they had. I mean, these were pretty big, and I think if you think of the 16th century version of a barge,
Okay.
that they would have had plenty of stuff on the deck. She's always going onto the deck, right, to sort of around in these things. It's not like she's hanging out underneath, going through the big cargo under the water, but it's more of on the deck.
Lisa C., I want to ask you a few other questions. I was going through IMDb and I saw a few things that didn't make much sense. Something about someone named Monica Highland and a book called Lotus Land.
So my mother, Carolyn C., and John Espy, my mother's longtime live-in friend, and I wrote 3 books under the name of Monica Highland. And these were we named ourselves for the intersection of Santa Monica and Highland.
And they came out then. What's the relationship between those early works and your later writing? Or were you kind of an apprentice at that point, or
Was I
what?
trying to what?
Yeah, well, I'm just curious. You wrote these books with 2 other people, and then you began working on your own.
Right.
Did it apprenticeship for you?
Absolutely. I mean, I did, my mother was a writer, John was a writer, 21 years between my mother and me, 21 years between my mother and John. They had a lot of more experience than I did. But this was a very democratic process, and it was before they had computers. And so I was the one who hand wrote everything. And so we would take turns talking, but the person who holds the pen has the final authority of what goes on the page. And so sometimes they'd be like telling a whole scene, and I would just be waiting. Like, I don't like that so much. But I did learn so much from them. And I feel, so my mother was a writer, John was a writer, but my mother's father was also a writer. And so I'm third generation. So much of my work habits comes from them. I feel like I did have kind of a lifelong apprenticeship. Sometimes I joke around like I'm glad they weren't plumbers, but gosh, why couldn't they have been brain surgeons? But I'm grateful I got to see working writers from the time I was a small child.
IMDb, of course, lists Snowflower and The Secret Fan because that's a film that came out. Were you happy with that one?
No, not really. No, I mean, there are some scenes in that film that I really like. I would not have been able to create in a novel. I mean, I did have it in the novel, but to see it visually was much better. The one that I always go back to is it's the there's a month of singing and crying in the upstairs chamber before someone marries out. And so I wrote that scene, and they're singing songs, but the Yao ethnic minority people who knew those wedding songs, and so the scene shows them, singing those wedding songs, and it's so to have the music, to have the voices. That's one of the wonderful things about film, that you take something that is only words on a page, but they can bring all the sound to it.
But the rest of it, meh. Well, you're the author.
Well, I mean, there were people who really loved the book, and if I tell you there's a scene with Hugh Jackman singing and dancing in it, you know that they made some changes.
Yeah, I was thinking, I know I saw it and I remember that, and I'm thinking, seriously? But it's
But
Hollywood.
here's the thing. I I have a very good friend, very old family friend, who was the longtime main book critic, sorry, film critic for the LA Times, Kenny Turan. And the writing was on the wall pretty early about the film. Like I was worried about it, and I knew that people really loved the book. And there was one time we were going out to dinner, and I said to him, I'm just really scared about what people are going to say. You can't reach the director, you can't reach the stars, but I'm pretty accessible. And so I just like, I don't know what I should say when people say, like, well, what did you, how did you do that? How did you let them do that to your book? And he told me a story about James M. Cain. So, Mildred Pierce, The Postman Always Rings Twice. I mean, these are, first of all, some of the greatest novels, but also these are classic films that at the time people would say to him, how could you let them do that to The Postman Always Rings Twice, for example? And he would answer, they did nothing to the book. It's still right there on the shelf. And that helped me so much. And I've obviously carried it to today. Film is completely different. A writer, a novel, somebody who writes novels, that's my vision. It's my aesthetic. We've been talking a lot about underlying themes. Those are my underlying themes. But a film belongs to the director. And the director, he or she, they have their own aesthetic. They have their own themes that they want to have. They interact with the actors in different ways. There's parts of the story that mean more to them than might have meant to me. So I just don't think it's a mistake to say that it's a bad film. I think it's better. It's just Wayne Wong's vision of that story. And he's an artist too. And as a director, that's his vision. It's, sometimes in the moment as you're seeing it, it's like, oh my God, but it can step back. I really believe that it is the director's vision, and that these are completely different ways of telling story. They're completely different media.
Well, talking to other writers, I see it more as you're lucky if it comes out in a way that satisfies you, and you're unlucky if it comes out in a way that doesn't. But the truth is, you give it away, you sell it, it's their business, and you got to let it go. period. Speaking of that, there are two other Lisa C. works in adaptation that I didn't know about. There's apparently either coming or maybe it won't come a Korean TV series of the Island of Sea Women, and the other is Peony and Love in Development.
Peony and Love was in development for about 10 years with Ridley Scott. And then finally, after 10 years, and they were very lovely because they kept paying me money every 18 months, but finally he let it go. And then Island of Sea Women is in development with a company in South Korea to be a television series. Someone asked me the other day, are they affected by the writer's strike? I actually don't know. Like, if you live in Korea, are you a member of Writers Guild here? I don't know. So I'm not sure if they have still been proceeding. I know they have a writer that they're working with who's developing the how this play out over 5 years. I haven't spoken to in a while because I've been out on tour for Lady Tan.
And one final question. Okay, Lady Tan was finished. It went through all of its edits. It came out. And that means that it was finished around a year ago, give or take. Have you started on another one?
I have done a lot of the research. I haven't started writing. I'm going to really be wrapping up all the touring for Lady Tan in about 2 weeks. And then we're going to go to Colorado and hole up there for maybe a month. And so I hope once I get there that I can really take all of the research that I have and start to put it together into at least a long out of what I want to have happen.
And can you give us a taste of when and where it takes
place?
So
this isn't the only historic backdrop, but I'll just say one of the major pieces is the 1871 Los Angeles Chinatown Massacre. And so Los Angeles at that time, only 5,000 people, tiny compared to San Francisco at that time. And it was considered to be the wildest of the Wild West towns, far more violent, far more gunslingers and shoot 'em ups than places like Deadwood, Dodge City, Laramie, all those places that we think of as being the Wild West towns. But Los Angeles was the most violent. And 10% of the population participated in the massacre. 10% of the Chinese were killed. They were shot, stabbed, hung. This is considered to be one of the largest mass lynchings in the history of our country. I'm telling the story from the perspective of, again, based on real women, 3 real women who lived there. And at that time, only 34 Chinese women in Los Angeles. I think about that a lot, like what their lives must have been like to be in this very rough and tumble town, just so few of them. And so I don't know if you want to hear more about it, but yeah, it's based on the true stories of 3 of these women and what happened to them and how each of them actually had a pretty big effect on not just the events of the massacre, but also how Los Angeles became a city, a real city. We'll call it a law and order city, and how it was able finally to join the rest of the country.
You've been listening to an interview with Lisa C., whose latest novel is Lady Tan's Circle of Women, and you can find out quite a bit more about the novel and see photos that presumably show us some of the scenes in the novel, the garden in particular, at lisac.com. I'm Richard Wolinsky on Book Waves. I'm Richard Wolinsky on the Book Waves Art Waves Hour.